So happiness, pleasure, satisfaction are kind of a trip, right? They seem to be the fundamental motivator behind most, if not all, of the things that we do. We do the things that we do because we want to better the circumstances of our life so that our experience of the quality of our life is better. And this belief is what caused Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 19th century to develop the ethical philosophy called utilitarianism. They operated from the belief that pain and pleasure are what Bentham called our sovereign masters. In other words, these two things, pain and pleasure, are what ultimately drive us to do all of the things that we do. We're almost, in a sense, enslaved to these things. They believe the things that we do because we want to avoid pain or acquire pleasure. And what they claimed is kind of what I touched on at the end of the last lecture, which is happiness, contentment, and satisfaction, they seem to have intrinsic worth. And what I mean by that is, we don't want to be happy because we think it'll make us a better employee. I mean, maybe that's one of the benefits, but we don't sit at home thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to really work on being more content in order to score better on my exams. We want to be content even if we don't get anything out of it. We want to be happy even if it leads to nothing. In other words, happiness, contentment, and satisfaction don't just have instrumental value, although clearly they do. They also have what's called intrinsic value. They have value in and of themselves regardless of what use they are put to. I just want to be happy. I just want to be content. I just want to be satisfied. I don't care about much of anything else. If I can just be those things, I'm good, Bentham and Mill would say. And so therefore they said, well, this must mean that happiness and contentment and satisfaction, these are actually the goods of life, right? These are the things that we want out of life. And so therefore, if these are the things we want, having more of these things would be better than having less of these things. And what they mean by that is this. They don't just mean that the happier I am personally, the better my life is. They mean that the more happiness you bring into the world, I bring into the world, my cat brings into the world, the more happiness that exists in total, the better things are. So imagine that we had a scale and we could evaluate the number of happiness units that exist at any given moment around the world. Okay? And it's a scale that runs from 0 to 100 units. And 100 is like, oh my gosh, there's maximal happiness, contentment, and satisfaction in existence right now. And we had 50 units of happiness, contentment, and satisfaction. And we knew that it was possible to increase that total amount of happiness from 50 to 55. Wouldn't it be kind of silly if we didn't do whatever it was that we could do to increase the net total happiness? So this is leading Bentham and Mill to the claim that if it's true that we would be doing something silly if we didn't increase the total quality of happiness when we had the ability to do so, then that must mean that the rightness or wrongness of our actions is going to be determined purely by the consequences of our actions. So the action that gets us from 50 units to 55 units of happiness, that action is a good action because not taking that action would result in us staying at 50 units of happiness. Okay? Similarly, if we know of an action we could take that's going to decrease the total happiness units from 50 to 40, we'd shake our finger at the person who's thinking about taking that action and say, no. We want to increase the total amount of happiness units in the world. We don't want to do anything that decreases it. And if we do something deliberately that decreases the amount of happiness units, we've done something wrong. Okay? So Bentham and Mill, utilitarians, claim this. An act that increases the happiness or pleasure, satisfaction, contentment, or at minimum just minimizes unhappiness and suffering is right and good. It's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do. And an act that decreases happiness or causes suffering, that's the wrong thing to do. That's a bad thing to do. Okay? So utilitarianism, like ethical egoism, is a consequentialist theory. It's a consequentialist theory because it doesn't really matter what the act is that you take. It doesn't matter what your motivations are. What matters is what's the situation that you're in and what is it that you need to do to bring about better consequences than would exist if you didn't do this thing. Okay, so in utilitarianism, there's no inherent moral quality to a person's motivations or intentions, or even the actions that they take, right? The actions are just an ends that we use to get to, the actions are a means that we use to get to a particular end. And the end is, I want to increase the greatest good for the greatest number. How we do that doesn't have any inherent moral quality to it. What really matters for the utilitarian are the consequences of what we do. And utilitarianism is an objectivist theory, just like egoism is, right? So utilitarianism doesn't say what you think or what your culture thinks or believes has any bearing on the truth value of your ethical claim. The utilitarian is going to say, no, the truth value of your ethical claim, the truth value of your statement about what we should or shouldn't do is not going to depend on what people believe. It's going to depend on what level of happiness or displeasure is going to be created by this action. If we can calculate out what that amount of happiness would be, and utilitarians think they can do that, then we can determine what objectively is the right or the wrong thing to do. Okay? Just like ethical egoism, utilitarianism has an act utilitarianism and a rule utilitarianism. An act utilitarian says, I can encounter every situation uniquely, and I determine the circumstances on the ground at that moment, and I make whatever decision I think needs to be made at that particular time to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. The rule utilitarian is going to say, I don't have that kind of luxury in life to be able to be deliberating with every single situation that I encounter. So I'm going to create rules that I think overall will result in the greatest good for the greatest number over time. Maybe sometimes I follow that rule and it doesn't produce the greatest good for the greatest number, but I think that overall, if we follow this rule, we'll produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay, so utilitarianism. Let's take a trip down this rabbit hole.